The Vince Dixon Show of history, current events, and the rule of law.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second broadcast of the Vince Dixon Show. The focus of our shows includes Vince's perspective as a noted historian on the purposes and evolution of government, a subject that should be on everyone's agenda in our world today. Today's show begins to look a little bit more in depth than we did during the first broadcast. And in particular, March 17th is known in many places, from Ireland to England to the United States, especially in cities like Boston and New York and many others, as St. Patrick's Day. And so it is. But in Greater Boston, Eastern Massachusetts, and nearby, it is a local observance of what is known as Evacuation Day. In our show today, as we explore both history and civic knowledge, Evacuation Day is described as an observance, worthy of great note because it is a celebration of the first great victory of Patriot forces against the once thought to be invincible British Army, nearly 250 years ago. Local holidays are often, even within a state or in an urban context, can grow up into national events. Classic examples are Thanksgiving and Juneteenth, for example. As we've been introducing the show, we recognize that many of us are distracted in this information age by our fascination with the internet, with the web, and now generative AI. These are major distractions and they affect our lives and our livelihood. This show, however, provides some aspects of a needed vehicle for providing insight and historical context in order to understand where we are at this time in history and how we might go forward as a nation. Vince's concept in developing this show is to provide an agenda for further historical and civic understanding. So on this show, we will look at Evacuation Day, its particular celebration of achievement, and its contribution to American civic culture. I'm Ron Latanison. I'm your co-host today. I'm sharing the stage with my colleague, Vince Dixon, who I'm happy to turn the floor to you, Vince.
Thank you, Ron, and welcome everyone to the Vince Dixon Show. In this program, in looking at the intersection of history and civic observance, we will touch on the creation of the Congressional Gold Medal and the rise of a self-taught Boston bookseller, Henry Knox, to the position of general in charge of artillery. Other future programs will look at civic observance, the embracing and the battling over of holidays, their meaning and their value. From time to time, more in-depth programs with the title Occurrence and Occurrence of Faith will more deeply analyze lesser-known aspects of our civic culture. On this program, we will explore a range of facts, areas of knowledge, and perspectives on our world in the broadest ways possible and in detailed aspects. We welcome questions, thoughts, and ideas. Civics is at once relatively simple, and its details and how they interact can be complex. Joining me on most of these shows is co-host Ron Latanison, also a person with a broad range of interests, a friend through the Wilson Science and Technology Forum. He shares with me many concerns about our evolving world and the value and values of various traditional aspects. And on the screen, you'll see some slides with some additional information that you can look back on. This program will be available on demand as well. This is myself, a picture on Cambridge Common, waiting the arrival of William Dawes, the reenacting writer. In this particular program, where we're looking at Evacuation Day, which happens to be St. Patrick's Day as well, I should notice that on my father's side, I have family lineage names that include Lynch and Cummings. And a long time ago in Brighton, there was a large house where people would gather on Sunday afternoon for dinner, and it was called Riley and Deliberately the House of Cummins, where all manner of discussions were addressed, and more on that at a later point. Exploring American history involves not just exploring events and their meaning, but also the meaning in civic law and civic observance, which is where Evacuation Day comes in. Episode number 2, The Importance of Evacuation Day, is our program today. Civics and civic literacy also has to do with how laws get made about observing things. Do businesses stay open? Do they close? What hours do they keep? Another part of regulation that a lot of people don't necessarily think about in the licensure that allows businesses to be operating in ways that help consumers. The importance of Evacuation Day is more than just an observance. It also has deep meaning, and its understanding has changed over the years. St. Patrick, his feast day, is assigned to March 17th. Long set of reasons for how feast days get assigned. This is a depiction of what St. Patrick might have looked like. In the end, in his latter years, he was thought to be a bishop, a crozier or stand of authority in his hand, and the mitre of a bishop. He was actually a British youth, not Irish, interestingly, who was kidnapped by Irish pirates, and for 6 years they held him, and he was a shepherd of flocks, eventually escaped back to England. He trained as a cleric, became a priest, studied, decided to return to Ireland because he thought the people were nice enough, but needed the message of the Christian viewpoint, became bishop of what is now considered the historic See of Ireland, Armagh, and revered as a saint, though nowadays the saint-making process or declaration is a little bit different, regarded in a wide range of places, including even in one of the Eastern Orthodox churches as a significant figure. When was St. Patrick's Day begun in Boston? Well, we don't know for sure, but there's indications that in the 1720s it was being observed by some people who were from the British Empire or England, but were Irish. And remember, again, an important part of this is that St. Patrick was originally a British lad. So you bring a little youth energy to the celebration and something of a tribal culture. Evacuation Day Boston 250 this year is a special observance because it is the 250th anniversary of Evacuation Day. For those interested further, there is Dorchester Heights in South Boston, and there will be special observances actually on March 17th, a ceremony at the monument. There will be historical reenactors that will be there, and special observances as well. And it's important because notice that Massachusetts, with the help of people from other eastern colonies, had forced the British out of Boston when the Declaration of Independence had not yet occurred, but Massachusetts, through the Suffolk Resolves, took itself as independent. This is the monument that was authorized in the late 1800s and has been restored and rebuilt a bit over recent years. And it is really a beautiful spot, recently redone. There has been some opposition to the holiday over time, mostly by people of sympathies with the British Empire, but occasionally other people. Some years ago, Governor Deval Patrick, under budget pressures, was told, hey, you can save money by making people work and not have a day off for a holiday. He tried to eliminate the holiday. Some state services do operate on March 17th, but many do not, and that varies by holiday. There was sufficient legislative support by Suffolk County District legislators. They nominally restored the holiday. It continues to be a small discussion. People far and wide know about the holiday, don't fully understand it. There was, of course, some remnant opposition of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic views throughout the history of Boston from the 1700s, and that kind of fueled the skepticism of the holiday being observed at all. Turns out that Evacuation Day had another twin, if you will, in New York City. Once the British were forced out of Boston, they still occupied New York, and in fact, we came across some material that Evacuation Day, really the last major city the British evacuated was New York City in 1783. In late November, November 25th, probably trying to get out of a New York winter. And this was actually a huge holiday until the 1860s, when Thanksgiving Day, the proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, and the events of the Civil War began to change things. But it turns out that Evacuation Day in New York City in November was a huge holiday at one time, well observed and well connected. The sense that the British were forced to leave by various circumstances to be celebrated with dinners and various parades and celebrations. This is the Massachusetts Independent 12 that I've defined because these are the dozen events that are most significant when we think about them. The first group are those that lead up to the foundation building events of Massachusetts going to become fully independent. The Liberty Tree protest originally, there is a plaque at the intersection of Washington Street and Boylston Street in Boston on the building. People don't always look up. It's a very impressive plaque. The Lexington Spinning Circle, which is where homemakers actually homespun, literally the term comes from that, rather than buy British yarn. The Boston Massacre, of course, the tragedy of dead people in a civil disturbance. The Boston Tea Party, the Suffolk Resolves, which we mentioned, which is actually the predecessor of the Declaration of Independence, which sounds at times a bit like an imitation of it, or an echo of it. Paul Revere's longest ride was taking the resolves that made Massachusetts functionally independent to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which endorsed them. And then you have the events of Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy that leads to the Siege of Boston next. During the Siege of Boston, there were various skirmishes and battles. The Battle of Chelsea Creek, which led to the end of a British ship of war without a Massachusetts Navy. The Battle of Bunker Hill, the huge cost on both sides, and the evacuation of Boston, which is the observance we're talking about here. Finally, the carrying through of the legal foundations. A provisional Congress of Massachusetts was thought not enough. There needed to be a basic document. John Adams wound up writing much of that, became the model of the U.S. Constitution. But when the U.S. Constitution was put out, it didn't have too much about rights, and so the Massachusetts Compromise actually defined most of the amendments that become what we call the Bill of Rights, which injects human beings and human rights into that document that we treasure today. The Siege of Boston, of course, began with the events of Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy, and lasts for the period from April 19th, 1775 to March 17th of 1776. And you see all these islands in this huge harbor, one of the greatest natural harbors in the world. The liberation of Boston is the harbor being freed. Remember, the nature of it is that natural harbor, and the islands themselves have value. Livestock was being raised there, hay and crops were being cut there, and the battles over control Boston included these islands. Boston Light was destroyed and rebuilt more than once. The Patriots had shut Boston Harbor and reopened it under their control less than a year later. The successes were both symbolic and functionally real in terms of the finances and the commerce that happened. The noble train of artillery, you see this line here that comes down from New York and across Massachusetts, and this is really important because those cannon brought by a Boston bookseller, largely educated from the books in his own library, his own bookstore. This is Colonel Henry Knox, an American military officer, politician, bookseller. He became a senior general of the Continental Army. He proposed with other people that the cannon be brought, and they were brought here. As a result of the evacuation, by the way, Congress authorizes what is the oldest medal of the United States. The design sent to France. The historical continuity of this decoration to this day, the medals are carefully designed to commemorate the person and or event being commemorated. These are depictions of those medals. These are actually pictures from the Boston Public Library where they reside in the rare books department. You see the image of Washington. On the reverse of it, Washington and his generals watching the sailing vessels of the British sailing out of Boston, and on the right, the cannon and cannonballs that caused that to happen. This is the notable engraver in Europe, in France, who created the original gold medal, and he himself might be the subject of a future program next. Dorchester Heights, South Boston was part of Dorchester as a dominating hill. It is where the cannon were placed. About 60 cannon. Wooden planks and platforms were prefabricated to allow ease of movement of the cannon in one night. This is an aerial of the monument and the hill. This is a depiction of the monument itself, a more recent vintage. This was authorized in 1898 in a Georgian revival style, and Governor Winthrop M. Crane dedicated it in 1902. By the way, if you look at the currency in your wallet or purse, the Crane paper factory still in Massachusetts that produces the paper that you have as your currency. These are the same family. General Thomas was the one who was actually in charge of the forces to bring the cannon that night of March 4th of 1776. He died on the invasion of Canada. This first civic observance begins in 1901, and this is by the old State House. Post-World War II, there was a renewed focus on veterans, and so many people have thought of the Evacuation Day Parade as a Veterans Day in Boston, though there had been a long prior history next. Henry Knox Thatcher, of some interest in a different way, he was the grandson of Henry Knox, became a rear admiral, served in the U.S. Navy for 40 years, and retired to Winchester, Mass. Lived the last 9 years of his life in the town of Winchester next. And it's time for our bit of discussion about all of this interesting stuff. Ron?
Yes. You know, I am continually amazed by Henry Knox. He was a bookseller, and yet he managed somehow to design and implement what must be one of the greatest engineering feats of our time. To be able to, during the dead of winter, to transport 60 tons of cannons across from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Where did he get the skill? How did he manage this? Or did he have some unknown support from engineers? And
well, the most important part was that he had self-taught himself from the books he kept in his bookstore. Many British military officers, and he was having a high-end bookstore.
Yeah.
So he had self-taught himself how to think about these things.
Yeah.
And well, cannon, amazingly enough, at that point in the 1700s, are already pretty sophisticated.
Yeah.
And so he knew what to do with them. The question was getting them here. And so he proposed the plan, word was put out, and that word was in fact sent out, and Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys and some others seized the fort, and those cannon were then prepared and brought down the length of New York and the width of Massachusetts. And at times it was troubling. They had to have horses, at times oxen are a little stronger. At times there wasn't much of a road, but as the word got across going forward, in many cases townspeople turned out to welcome and help the cannon along. And basically this is one of the things that American mentality is. Most people say, well, can you really do that? Or maybe you can't. And Americans say, well, of course you can. We just don't know how to do it yet, and we'll figure it out.
Well, it was a monumental achievement, frankly. And it was
60 cannons, not just 60 tons. Several of the cannons were actually a couple tons themselves.
All right. I stand corrected, Mr. Historian. Thank you. But, think about this. If he were not successful, we would not be here today in the same circumstances, would we? That was really an existential commitment and success.
Well, ultimately, you're right in a different way because it saved lives.
Yes.
Washington and his commanders were actually planning a ground assault.
Yeah.
And if you know the area around the Museum of Science and Leechman Square and the edge of Beacon Hill and Back Bay, that's where the ground assault against Boston was going to happen. And with 15 to 20,000 militia and some training and some sophisticated people, that battle would have been won by the Patriots, but at the cost of substantial numbers of British and Patriot lives. So by cannon being put up there overnight, with almost no warning, the British thought about taking the hill, but then remembered the casualties of Bunker Hill and said, we're out of here.
Well, another question on the Henry Knox theme. Fort Knox is in Kentucky is what I think of when I think of Fort Knox, where we store gold. But there is a Fort Knox in Maine. And in Maine, that Fort Knox was, I think, generated to prevent the British from coming down from the north along the rivers.
I will look that up.
I visited there, and I was fascinated by it. Sure. It was literally a military fortress, and Henry Knox's name is associated with it. And
well, I will certainly look that up.
Okay.
We welcome questions in this program. And Maine, of course, was part of Massachusetts
Yeah.
until 1820,
Yeah.
and there had been border skirmishes and wars in the 1700s conducted by earlier governors of Massachusetts with militia forces of Massachusetts without the British being involved. Disputes about border with Maine and so on, that we don't have quite the same echo today. I thank you for that, and we've actually done a lot here in terms of our programming today, and we will continue this because Henry Knox himself and his grandson are part of an interesting military history.
Sure.
And to this day, actually Henry Knox Thatcher was for a while in charge of an earlier version of the Charlestown Navy Yard. And in the early days of the Civil War, the recommendations for the expansion of the U.S. Navy to shut off the Confederacy from international travel. So thank you. This is a picture of Henry Knox Thatcher, who served during the Civil War and retired to Winchester. And you see the Union-type uniform of the time and a kind of gruff but friendly fellow. Future shows will further explore the purposes of government and its evolution, and this holiday is part of that kind of a mentality government does get involved in. Should you have a holiday and what kind of observance there should be? There'll be a further discussion of that. We'll look at Francis Perkins, author of The New Deal, The History of Industrial Revolutions, Rerum Novarum, Educating for Transformational Change, and what civics and civic learning is about on a program that you'll see probably in the near future. Our standard disclaimer, Vince Dixon Show seeks to provide a range of factual descriptions of history, its meanings, its results, and a lot more. Opinions expressed are those of the individual stating them in good faith in the pursuit of historical understanding, civic education, and public knowledge. We seek to inform, not to offend, and we welcome any comments, suggestions, or ideas for other shows. The availability of myself as a historian, I've delivered numerous programs on history, civics, government, public policy, and related fields. I'm available as a speaker, teacher, and or public commentator. These episodes will be available on various other formats. We'll provide additional information as we go. And if you wish to have further contact, the best and fastest is Vince Dixon 99, VINCE DIXON 99 @yahoo.com. We are reminding people and opening the opportunity for sponsorships and partnerships. Civics, civic literacy, and civic education are central to the mission of this show, and we encourage and welcome participation and invitations to make further presentations. This edition is copyrighted by myself, Vincent Lawrence Dixon. Ron Latanianson, our co-host, has helped in the conception and detail of this program, helps in the overall design. This particular program recorded and produced at WinCam, Winchester Community Access and Media, but does not necessarily reflect the views of WinCam, its staff, or the staff of other programming entities that show this program. Content has been utilized or shown, deliberately screened to meet the standards of public domain and fair use. Emily Ann Kernline is production assistant and liaison on behalf of Massachusetts Presentations and Dixon Enterprises, and I am the producer of this edition and the overall series. Thank you for watching and listening, and tune in again next when you see The Vince Dixon Show, and feel free to be in touch. This is a program that we have enjoyed doing, and hopefully share knowledge and public information, and we welcome people creating a broader network in conjunction with the knowledge of myself and Ron and the other topics that we will address over time. And thank you.
Thank you, Vince. And ladies and gentlemen, join us next time for a discussion of civics and civic literacy. Thank you very much for being with us today. Goodbye.